Hello, everyone, and welcome. This is Mary Magnuson, and I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar on broadband considerations in site selection and data centers. This is one in a series of monthly webinars Blandin Foundation offers for our Blandin broadband communities and open to anyone with an interest in using technology to improve community. Before we begin, I'll point to the chat box on the lower left corner of your screen. To interact with us at any time during today's webinar, you can simply type your question or comment into the chat box. And now let's get started. Again, my name is Mary Magnuson, and I work here at the Blandin Foundation, and I administer the Blandin Community Broadband Program. Joining me today is Bill Coleman of Community Technology Advisors, who I'm sure many of you know. Bill has been the Blandin Foundation's primary broadband program consultant for a number of years. Bill will introduce our guest speakers today. They are Tom Lambrecht of Great River Energy and Gene Goddard of Greater MSP. Take it away, Bill.
Thank you, Mary. Many people always want to make the link between economic development and broadband networks. And we think it's fairly obvious that there's tremendous potential to get economic development results, returns out of broadband networks. But it's a lot of times it's at in individual businesses and home entrepreneurs and so on. Today we're talking about a very different topic, and it's using broadband networks as a tool to recruit businesses into your community, either information technology businesses, manufacturers, service companies, or on the other hand, something that doesn't have a lot of jobs but provides a lot of tax base in data centers. Today we have two of Minnesota's leading minds on these kind of site selection activities, recruiting businesses and landing them to come to your community. Tom Lambrecht is Manager of Economic Development Services for Great River Energy, has been very active across mostly northern Minnesota in terms of helping rural electric cooperatives and their communities position themselves to attract businesses of all kinds. They've had a big interest in broadband and data centers over the last couple of years. Gene Goddard, my old cube mate at the Department of Economic Development years back, is now Director of Business Investment for Greater MSP, our Twin Cities Regional Economic Development Group. They're going to tag team this presentation, going back and forth, and then we'll have plenty of time for questions and discussion as well. So I'm going to turn it over now to Gene Goddard to start the presentation. Gene? Gene?
There I am. Sorry about that. Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks, Bill. Thanks, Mary and Tom, and everybody who's listening in. A lot of our discussion today is going to talk specific towards data centers. We're going to take a few slides to talk about some specific projects that we've worked on in the Minneapolis-St. Paul region that broadband was a critical part of the incentive package and the development package for the projects. But a lot of our discussion is going to be on data centers, which Tom and I have been working on quite a bit for the last few years, and how important the broadband and high-speed telecommunications and other infrastructure needs are important to them. We're also going to hit on some other key points, the power rates, free cooling, if you haven't heard of that word before, and other things related to data center site selection. So I'm going to start off, and then Tom and I are going to go back and forth as we go along through the presentation. So what are some of the Greater MSP's location advantages for data centers? Right off the bat, one of the things that's talked about most with data center site selection is power rates. This is one piece where Minnesota, you can see we have a slight advantage, but also a disadvantage in data center consumption of power. A lot of the facilities that have located over the last few years, you may have heard conversations about Google or Microsoft or Yahoo as they've located around the country, have tended to go to places where lower cost energy is available, like in Iowa where they use some Duke power, the Duke and Duke locations where they're getting power out of the hydropower out of the NTVA, or northern Washington state where they're getting power out of the Columbia River Basin, which makes it very cost effective for those organizations to locate there. So power is a critical piece, and Tom's going to talk a little bit more of that here. And also they're looking at fuel mix. You know, when you compare Minneapolis, St. Paul, or Minnesota to other parts of the country, coal is a critical piece, and then shifting over to natural gas. Minnesota is a little bit ahead of the game, and again, Tom will talk more about this on this fuel mix, generation mix, because we've made the conversion, or have started the conversion away from coal much faster than many of our competitor locations have. And so as they can start to build out their new renewable or lower cost, lower carbon footprints, we're going to be in an advantage moving forward throughout the state. One of the other keys, again, towards data center location is where the power is. So access to substations is a critical part of this whole site selection process. Being able to provide power from multiple substations or multiple transformers, so that redundancy is the key. Most data centers want sources from at least 2, sometimes even 3 sources of power coming in, so that if some idiot with a backhoe doesn't run into a power line and cause your multi-million-dollar data center to go down. Tom?
Thanks, Gene, for teeing up the electric discussion, and good afternoon to everybody. I see a number of familiar names on the list, so it's good to hear or see you all represented around the state. I'm going to cover some of the utility discussion that also give you, kind of an overview of some of the overall activities that we're involved with Great River Energy, working with a number of you on the phone too. So with that, I have initially just an overview of who Great River Energy is. So we are an electric generation and transmission cooperative. We are based in Maple Grove, but we have 28 member co-ops that own Great River Energy, and they represent about 665,000 accounts. Now those are meters. That translates to about 1.5 million people roughly across the state. But obviously it's very diverse. So for all of us who are familiar with Minnesota, you know that there's different pockets of metro and rural, but there's also a different industry mix across our system. Whereas we might have a lot of mining and manufacturing and timber to the north, we have maybe medical device and other manufacturing in the central part, and then a lot of agriculture production in the southwest. So the blue area on the map really just represents where our members are. Of course, we're intermingled with Xcel Energy and Minnesota Power and a bunch of other utilities and municipal utilities. So we don't serve that whole blue area, but we have that geographic footprint. So that being said, we do have the numbers there of what we, how big we are and all that, but we generate about 3,600 megawatts of generation in our portfolio. As Gene talked about, there's a shifting mix of generation resources, and while we have that 3,600 total, 700 megawatts are renewable under the wind contracts that we have with a number of wind development farms around southern Minnesota and in North Dakota. But then we also have, with the other parts of that generation mix, include natural gas for a lot of our peaking facilities. We have some very small solar arrays, even though we are just announcing a couple of big projects relative to the 3,600. We're doing a 2 megawatt solar array, and that's a pretty big deal for us, but it's 2 versus 3,700, or 3,600. So that's the generation side of our mix, and of course balancing all that to keep those rates affordable and make sure that the power is delivered as reliably as possible. We rely heavily on our transmission grid. So as you see that we have about 4,700 miles of transmission, And that comes into play quite a lot when you get into the data center world. As Gene alluded to, multiple feeds is almost a requirement from any data center site, and I'll talk a little bit more about that as we go. But 4,700 miles of transmission lines. One thing just to note from our perspective compared to some of the other utilities, so we have roughly about, I don't know the number, average, I guess it's roughly 5 members per mile of transmission, compared to maybe an XL or a municipal who has 30 to 40 members per mile of transmission investment. So we have a much more vast area and project area that is, all the rural parts of the state. So anyway, we have a high degree of maintenance that we have to deal with on that transmission grid. So in our economic development department, and I'll highlight that in a little bit, we really focus on these 3 Ps, if you will, and it's really about planning and partnership and promotion. That's the catch, kind of lingo that we use. But it really is about helping our communities and our members to plan and think about where those opportunities are best suited. Now, clearly, data centers may be better suited for a metro area in the sense that there's workforce and that there's support network of supply chain and electricians and all that, but there very much are rural areas that are well suited as well. And as Gene alluded to, some of these big data centers that are looking at locations in Iowa and Washington State and other areas, the very large data centers are very much wanting to be as remote as possible and yet still tap into that workforce and all those other amenities. So it's not necessarily true that it's only going to be in the metro area. It is going to be on both sides of the coin, if you will, from location decisions. Partnering is a big thing for us. Obviously, we have some programs and some tools that we administer, but we also know that we're not commanding or demanding any activity across the system. We rely heavily on the communities and the staff people and economic developers that are out there. Also, working with groups like Greater MSP and the Greater Mankato Growth and Apex and some of those regional economic development agencies, along with the state of Minnesota, indeed, really helps us to leverage our role and try to get more feet on the ground in different parts of the process. So talk a little bit more about that, but then clearly promotion. The big thing with this is messaging and materials and activities. The messaging is as much internal as it is external. So when, for example, we have programs like a data center attraction program, we need to heavily coordinate with our members and with our transmission and system operations people to know that there needs to be timely responses on inquiries. There needs to be very good response in the sense that, for example, you can't answer the phone and say, well, a data center, that's going to be a big headache for us. No, you can't say that. You need to say, yes, we can serve you, and we'll do that as quickly and as most affordably as possible. So there's a lot of those internal messages as well as getting our message out to that third-party stakeholder that we'll get into a little bit, let them know what our opportunities are. So that's kind of the framework of what we look at. In the role of identifying assets, this is a big part of what we do at our level, and all the members that Great River Energy help us in this. We really need to know what is where those opportunities are. So I'll talk a little bit more about our site inventory process that we're going through, and where those crosshairs of transmission and fiber, specifically for data centers, are. But also, how do we best deal with communities in the sense of making sure that they're ready to go and ready to take that call for a prospective project. Some of the public policy alignments that are out there don't always match up well with business attraction or business retention or expansion projects. And I say this with all respect to any of you that have dealt with this, but if your community gets a call and says that we want to expand a facility, or we want to attract this new facility into your town, you need to kind of have a pretty well prepared response in that, you have to say, we'll do what we can, and maybe we'll consider, tax abatement, or maybe we'll consider a new hookup fee reduction, and some of those things that help incentivize those projects to happen, or even allowing the zoning to be modified to allow those projects. And we had a data center company that was looking at a site we thought was a very good site from our perspective, and literally when it came to the rezoning question at the community, the city council voted it down and said they didn't want a data center there. So we weren't quite as prepared as we thought we were in that community to suit that project. So all that is part of that community readiness. And then generally the incentives, I've talked a little bit about those just a second ago, but just knowing what your community is willing to do. You don't always have to have all the incentives on the table, but you do have to have some conversations ahead of the game so that when a company is looking for your community, you're able to answer them definitively on that we will do this and we won't do that kind of response. I'll get into some of the rebate discussion here in a minute too, but I'll turn this back over to Gene more on the national issues.
Thanks, Tom. So since this is a broadband discussion, I want to talk about fiber and telecommunications connectivity. So when you look at this map and where Minneapolis-St. Paul is located and the issues related to connectivity, we're well suited for data center locations or companies that need high broadband capability because of our location. Now, we run into issues with some data centers that have looked in the Chicago markets and others because of basically traffic jams that are happening through the Cermak building there. We see some of that here with the 511 building, not as much as we're seeing in Chicago today. One other advantage that Minneapolis-St. Paul has on a national standpoint is our connections going north into Canada. So you think the major connections crossing the border are either in Seattle or in Buffalo, New York to cross, or in northern New York, almost to Vermont. So there tends to be some traffic jams and hard times getting information across. So companies that are looking at international communications can get out of Minnesota much easier through the connections that we have. Now, looking at the region-wide, it's important to understand when looking for a data center location is to take that earlier map that I showed of
I see that Gene disappeared up. Oh, hi, Gene. Are you there? Here he is. Gene?
He's moving around.
Back in. Well, that was weird. I'm turning his voice.
Well, I can pick up a little bit. We're kind of getting into the next slide, but that are mine. But clearly understanding what that local fiber network is in your communities is probably very critical to these discussions when we're out dealing with clients looking for Minnesota opportunities. So Gene's slide here just indicates he's got a good map of the.
Am I back on now?
Yes.
Hey, Gene.
Okay.
Yeah. I was filling in the
sorry.
best I could.
You did a great job. So again, looking at this map on top of the substation map I showed earlier, data centers tend to locate where there's a convergence of the two. So access to multiple providers, not just one. Typically, they're looking anywhere from 4 to 6 different providers coming into a building is critical for the marketplace. And as you can see throughout the Minneapolis-St. Paul, the list on the right-hand side kind of breaks down of where we're at. So this is pulled from an online source called Fiber Locator, or through an organization called NEF. Tom has that available through the communities that are part of his member organizations. Cities can access this system for about $100 a month, which is not cheap, but it's a good way to keep on top of where the fiber is located, maybe in your community or your region. So maybe a regional group may be a better source to access this info. So let me scroll down here to the next slide. And then looking at the local level, which is a critical component, is make sure that you have the mapping of your fiber within your community. This is something that Egan has produced based upon, they have a right-of-way permitting process within their community. So they know where all the fiber is at and tracked it very closely. You can use Go for One as well as another resource to get access to developing maps for where the fiber is located in your town. So again, it's real critical to take these maps and layer them on top of substation maps to help in finding data center locations. The last piece that we need to talk about is latency and how Minneapolis-St. Paul fits within the world. We did a study together with NEF a couple of years ago to try to figure out what kind of data centers will best be served in the Minneapolis-St. Paul market based upon our location in the world, based upon the latency of getting packets of information to those key business centers of the United States and globally. And we turned out pretty well, but one thing that we did find from this study is that we may not be the best location for companies that are doing online trading. So where microseconds means the difference between a $1 million gain and a $100 million gain on a transaction, where locations on the East Coast may be better served for that kind of activity. So we think from where we're positioned based upon our latency, we're a good location for disaster recovery facilities, for organizations that don't need that critical time-related data center operations until the infrastructure continues to get built out by the national carriers, which we're starting to see further. Tom?
Of our power infrastructure. Some of this is kind of what Gene's touched on as well. This is in Northport Industrial Park in North Mankato. I'll talk a little bit more about our site evaluation program in a minute, but what we did when we started to look at the areas that we serve, what we're highlighting here is a substation that basically was built in about 20 years ago that was very robust in the size that it was able to accommodate. It was built as an 80 megawatt substation, planning on all the growth to continue through that North Mankato Industrial Park, and there certainly has been growth in that whole region, and for those of you that are down there and might be familiar with it. But that being said, you can see under the arrow there and around to the north, that's basically the industrial park is flat and green and ready to be built upon. It's all zoned and permitted, and there's utilities in there, and a substation that has still about 75 megawatts of capacity on it. Now, what we started to do was say, well, obviously that's a good sub for a big power user. We knew that there were some potential projects or companies in the industrial park that might benefit from having an IT kind of data center built in that area. So we started to look at that site along with our many others across our system that might be a very suitable site for data center development. In addition to that, we have fiber infrastructure. As Gene alluded to, we do subscribe to the fiber locator, and this is just an example of what we've done for a proposed site in Lakeville. This is a site that's the I-35 is right along the left side of that map there. But you can see where we actually, through fiber locator, were able to identify where the map, on the map, where exactly the fiber is close to that site. Typical data centers, obviously, they like to have fiber on site if possible or adjacent to that. But just knowing that it's within a half mile or a quarter mile is at least good information that allows them to make a decision on obviously construction and timing and how easy it would be to pull that into their community. So this site that was highlighted in yellow was just one that we've looked at for potential development that we knew the fiber was close. So that was kind of our first gate to get through to make sure that we're not going to be requiring miles and miles of fiber to build to that site. So that being said, well, I guess here we go, Gene. Back to you.
Okay. So the access to fiber, access to power is very rational, thought-out, scientific analysis, lots of spreadsheets and computations done in that area when companies that we work with are looking to site a data center. Now comes the irrational part of it, where some science but more emotional comes into play. If you look at this natural disaster risk profile map of the United States, everything highlighted in the red or the darker colors shows an area of the United States where it's prime for a natural disaster risk profile to happen. And those in the lighter colors of the white or the lighter yellow color is where Minneapolis, St. Paul, and Minnesota falls. So you would think rationally that people would want to be in those locations where you're going to have lower risk profiles. And they say that all the time in the conversations that we have, but yet companies locate data centers where their customers are. So if their customers are in Silicon Valley or in the eastern seaboard in the middle of a hurricane or an earthquake territory, they tend to want to locate near their customers. Now what's helped us with all the things we've talked about on the fiber and the power side is that we have customers located in the Minneapolis-St. Paul marketplace in the Midwest and Minnesota that can provide a location for a data center to locate and not have to worry about the risk profile. But when you look at the risk profiles and how Minnesota compares to other locations, you know, floods, very important. You think about all the data centers that were destroyed during Hurricane Sandy on the eastern seaboard. So we've seen some movement of some of those facilities further into the middle part of the United States, including Minnesota. Snow. You know, people's vision of snow is from where they live. So in Dallas, when we've been there in March where they get 2 inches of snow, the entire city shuts down. Here, we don't have a problem with that. But the feds can look at snow and ice combined as when they're calculating damage by winter storms. And you can see just between Minnesota and North Carolina during the last decade how well positioned we were and lower costs to a North Carolina location. And that's critical for a lot of power systems because they tend to be, on the East Coast for sure, are above ground, and when ice lands it pulls down power lines. Hurricanes and tropical storms, again, Minnesota does not have those. Fires, you know, years ago when we had wildfires in northern Minnesota, there was concern about how that might impact power lines or other lines up north or data center locations. Well, if you look at us between Arizona, Phoenix, which is another leading data center location in the country, we compare very well. We just don't have. So how else does Minnesota's environment and our location play a role in data center location? And one of them is something called free cooling. These are images that some people think of Minneapolis, St. Paul, or Minnesota in general, but it's an advantage for us in saving energy and costs of cooling a data center. When you think about these facilities where big warehouses with lots of computers creating lots of heat, you got to get that heat out some way. And utilizing airside economization, airside cooling in Minnesota is a cost-effective way for data centers to locate in our community. Many of you may have heard about Google putting a major data center in Norway to take advantage of free cooling along with water coming from the mountains that's very cold as well. So in Minnesota, almost 314 days out of the year, you can use free cooling to lower the cost of operating your data center facility. So now let's switch over to business assistance programs that can be utilized to help data centers locate Minnesota. We have one tool that...
Gene, I have a...
Go ahead, Tom.
Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but I was going to comment quickly on a sidebar. We were at a trade show data center conference in New York last year, and Kevin McKinnon from DEED and I were there, and we were talking about the free cooling, and we had a booth that had a big sign that said free cooling, and even though most of the people we were talking to had never been to Minnesota and thought, you know, there's nothing west of the Orange County line in New York, it was or New Jersey, they liked the word free, so we got a lot of attention with our free cooling banner. Even though they probably have as much of it there too, but that was a very nice grabber for those business attraction people. Anyway.
Thanks. Yeah, we hear that all the time. You know, that it's a big advantage for us, and some companies are actually choosing to be north of a line in the middle of Iowa geographically, so that they can take advantage of the cooling opportunities that we have here. So then let's talk about incentives. Minnesota has one major incentive that we think positions us very well, and from what we've heard from the real estate community is that it really does position us well. So what the incentive is for a new data center locating within the state, if it's at least 25,000 square feet in size, the entire building, it doesn't have to be a raised floor that size, but the entire building, and the company or its, if it's a co-location provider, its customers or people within their building come up with or invest $30 million on everything that goes into the building, energy systems, fiber lines, building construction, software, mouse, routers, servers, whatever goes into developing that data center. So if you spend $30 million over 4 years, the company gets a rebate on all that sales tax that they spent during the first 4 years, and then moving forward, they don't have to pay sales tax for the next 20 years. And then they also don't have to pay the sales tax on energy consumption as well. So Minnesota is only one of 12 states to begin with that does not charge a sales tax on energy used in the manufacturing process. We wanted to treat data centers much like manufacturers are because they're big power users, so we wanted to make sure that that exemption of energy tax is not there as well. So that's a significant incentive. So combined, what we've read and seen from some studies that McGladrey has done for some of our partner companies is that it can be as much as $65 to $70 per kWh savings for that company over time. So think about, say, about a $200 million project. That will save them $10 to $15 million just on equipment alone over a 5-year period, which is a significant savings. And then every 3 to 5 years, they're replacing all of that equipment. So then again, over a time period of 20 years, that's significant cost savings to them. Where other states like Iowa, North Carolina, Texas, they have higher thresholds of either $150 or $250 million spend, and it doesn't include the customers inside of the facilities. So it's a long term, we think this is an advantage for us and for our businesses within the state. There's also a second smaller data center incentive on the market that was originally created for Thomson Reuters years ago, specifically targeting companies that manage online computer retrieval systems or deal with healthcare records. So for data centers that aren't spending the $30 million threshold, if they are in a rural community or in a regional trade center within the state, they could potentially access this incentive, which also is a sales tax exemption on equipment used in those facilities. So if you have any questions, you can ask further about that one moving forward. So looking at the main incentives, who's received it over the last 24 months. This is a list of data centers within the metropolitan area that have received the incentive based upon their expenditures. And 13 have already gotten designation, and we know of another 3 or 4 that are in their process to date to get that exemption. So this is really what has spurred growth in the region for those facilities. All right. Turning just a couple quick slides away from data centers to talk about broadband for manufacturers or other businesses. I wanted to talk quick about what we're seeing from the companies that we're working with that are outside the data center marketplace that are needing broadband connectivity for their locations. So, of course, you hear a lot about 3D printing or using computer modeling for manufacturers and how they're designing their facilities or designing their product lines. Flow of that information back and forth between locations is a critical piece for them to choose where they're going to locate. So thinking back on those maps that we showed about where broadband is located is an important key for those locations to take place. Now, customized products and market segmentation is also very important. But it's also it's company dependent. Not every business has the same need for data communications networks. So it's really, when you're talking with a firm, you got to figure out what their key points are. And some companies that we've worked with, specifically in Shakopee and Scott County over the last 12 months, and locating their facilities that needed extensive broadband capability are firms like DataCard, which is a company that's basically a software or a computer engineering company, but their product is keyless entry cards or cards for entering buildings, their voting cards, their cards for passports in some countries. So transferring information and data back and forth around the globe is real critical for them. Emerson Process Management is another one. They have 3 facilities within the metropolitan area, and building this 4th location in Shakopee was important because they wanted to make sure that all of their facilities were connected on the same fiber grid. So by working with Scott County and the county using their broadband network, was able to connect all 4 of the buildings, even the ones that are outside of Scott County, to the same network, which allowed the company to save tens of thousands of dollars on their annual bottom line by having that connection. And the last one is the Amazon piece. Of course, Amazon, they're highly automated, large connectivity, and the county in all 3 cases utilized their network to connect the buildings free of charge for the business, looking at their infrastructure as like you would a highway or a road to bring to the building that public infrastructure would pay for, but allowing them to connect whatever service provider that they wanted to those systems or to those facilities. All right, I'll turn it back over to Tom.
Sure. So I'm going to talk a little bit here about some of our site assessment program, and we started this through Great River Energy in 2013. We really kicked it off in 14, and we really needed to find, again, where these hotspots or best spots were for data centers. And as Gene and I both have talked about, we really, in addition to knowing where those sites were, we really had to figure out the best way to approach these companies and understand all of the components of these decisions, not just the fact that we have good power infrastructure, but we needed to understand the latency issue. We needed to understand the incentives and what goes into these decision-making processes at large companies that have maybe never been to Minnesota. So we really started this across our system in a sense to increase our own knowledge about the industry. But then also, we didn't have a standardized platform for the ways to respond to a lot of these inquiries that were coming into Minnesota due to the incentive programs and all the good work by folks like Gene to attract companies. When we'd get an RFI from the state or from a company saying, we want all your best sites, we would literally get 42 different formats. Some of them would just be an email, text, and some would be a plat map, and some responses would have more details than others. So we wanted to create this consistency and a platform where we could standardize our response, and we knew where those best spots were. And then clearly getting to know the industry helps us to get out there in the markets and talk to the right decision makers. So Gene and I both have been traveling a little bit to these data center shows and not just listening to their working at a trade show and trying to get them to consider Minnesota, but speaking on panels and having one-on-one conversations with the right industry leaders has been helpful. So in our process, here is I'm not going to read through all this, but this is kind of the decision tree of a data center, and it includes a lot of factors. Now, clearly we talked a lot about power and fiber. There's understanding the network, but again, it's also the real estate and the talent that's around, and making sure we know what supply chain workers are here, whether it's electricians or design firms or supply manufacturers like cable providers and all of those important industries. And then last, in the lower left there, the risk profile. We talked about the physical natural disaster risk, but most of these decisions being made in some site selector's office in Chicago or Atlanta. They're not coming to look at the site. So they may say, well, I'm going to get 1,000 or 100 sites to review, and we're going to measure all of those based on risk. And that risk includes the natural side of it, but physical risk, but also the financial risk and generally the tolerance of what is there for the community to support it. You know, if I build a data center in North Mankato, is there going to be enough employees there to attract at least the employees that I need online, or do I need to have, you know, people drive in from Minneapolis every time something goes wrong? So all those factors go into it. There really is, again, the crosshairs of all these infrastructure pieces, the physical geography, and the surroundings. So what we started to do with this site assessment is gather information that's current within 5 years. A lot of you on the call probably have seen us talk about this, but we hired a site selection firm who's done a lot of work with data center positioning around the country and the globe in Deloitte Real Estate to come out and do a validation of our sites and make sure that almost as a mock presentation, they would said, okay, we need 30 days. We need you to submit everything you can. And some of the sites that we had thought were good sites turned out not to be necessarily a good site because they had wetlands that they weren't fully disclosing or weren't aware of. And maybe they didn't have all the information put together. So that's really what this assessment tool started with. I'm not going to go through all the details. You can look at those at your leisure. But there's quite a lot of work that we asked our communities to provide. In that process, we also studied the market that is out there. And as we've talked about, you know, the other areas that we're competing against, we really tried to find, okay, if there's a market in Minneapolis that's emerging, that's great, but we are competing with Omaha and with Denver and Kansas City and Chicago and you know, everywhere else in the world. But how do we stack up when we look at market and workforce, labor cost, total cost of ownership here? Maybe it is related to energy costs, but it's also related to the tax climate and the fact that we have this free cooling helps maybe to make us look a little bit more comparable to sites that have real cheap hydropower in the south, for example. So all those parts of the site assessment tool led to us doing this kickoff in 14. We came down to 5 sites that were selected for on-site evaluation, including the criteria that we established. These sites had to be 20 acres. They had to have fiber providers. They had to be within 100 miles of the airport. You know, all those lists there. It couldn't be next to a nuclear plant or chemical facilities, because those are risk factors that most data center site selectors do not enjoy. So that being said, we have 5 sites that initially came forth, and we had all the vetted opportunities for those sites, and North Mankato, as I alluded to earlier, was one of those. We have a couple of others in St. Cloud and in the metro area, and we're working on additional sites. So that brings me to this next slide is really our study of mega sites. So as I think about this broadband and the fiber connectivity, there have been a number of inquiries coming into the Minnesota deed office for very large data centers. These data centers are typically looking for 100 acres or more. They're probably in the 50 to 100 megawatt size of power, which is just astronomical. And how can you serve those? So we've studied and developed 2 sites right now that we know are very suitable for this type of a development. We're still strategizing on how best to take those out to the marketplace, but we know that there aren't that many places in Minnesota that can easily accommodate a 150 megawatt data center. So we want to make sure we know where those are and make sure that we have a fully integrated approach within our members and our communities and our internal leadership here at GRE, and then the external partners like Greater MSP and Deed, to make sure that we know how to best position those to the customers that are out there. So that's all the work we've been doing on evaluating and studying these sites. Fiber providers, when you look at these mega sites, as Gene mentioned earlier, they're not looking for 1 and 2 fiber providers in the area. They're actually looking for 5 to 7 or 10 fiber providers within a few, very short miles, so that they can actually, get that fiber neutrally, so that there's multiple options for these big carriers that come in. I see a question from Bernadine on the chat. Does any of these factors deal breakers if they don't measure up? Absolutely, there are deal breakers. I don't know that there's a real priority, other than you can't have a nuclear facility next door. You can't have gas lines running through the middle of your property. I think there is quite a lot of things, sites that we've looked at, a number of them, where they literally, when you get out to the site, you say, oh my gosh, there's that wetland doesn't look at all manageable, or there's no road access, or the zoning for this area is rural preservation, so there's a lot of public policy issues you'd have to work through in order to get this allowed on that site. So yeah, there are deal breakers for sure, and we try to mitigate those up front as much as we can, but definitely some physical deal breakers can't be overturned.
Yeah, just to play off what Tom said.
Probably the biggest.
Yeah. Just to play off a little bit what Tom mentioned earlier about risk, besides the natural disaster risk profile, the risk of anything being unknown. Companies are okay with something being negative, but they want to make sure that there is nothing that's unknown as we move forward. So then lastly, looking at, we just want to talk about a little bit on, I'm sorry, are you guys getting my feedback here?
You're okay.
Okay, so just lastly, wanted to highlight some of the successes that we've had in the last couple of years, and identify some of those facilities that have come into the region, which are important to the growth of telecommunications networking and tools for all the companies in our region. And then show you just kind of on a map where they're located. They tend to cluster around each other, and because a lot of them have the idea that somebody located in a spot first, they're smart people, and so we want to be near them. So if you look at the map that we have here showing where the data centers are located within the Minneapolis-St. Paul region, a lot of them are close to each other or within a few miles of each other.
So really,
right.
Eagan, downtown Minneapolis, and the northwest suburbs?
In the southwest suburbs, downtown St. Paul. Again, as Tom mentioned, some of the other things that are in the site selection process, they don't want to be in a floodplain. They don't want to be next to manufacturers or things that could blow up. Natural gas pipelines are a critical issue that they want to be away from. And then often, depending on whether you're using airside or waterside cooling, access to large volumes of water is important too. So a typical data center, say about 100 to 150,000 square feet of total building size, would need somewhere between 1.5 and 2 million gallons of water a month. So
that's a lot of water.
Okay.
So, well, with that, I threw in a kind of a slide of all of our Great River Energy team here. Some of you probably know Jeff Borling, who works for us, who's based up in Duluth to kind of cover some of the northern territories. And Erin Sparks is based in Maple Grove here with me, and she's been instrumental on doing this data center site assessment program with Deloitte. So we're all available to answer additional questions, and by all means, if you're served by one of our member co-ops, we would love to talk to you more about suitability in your area.
Good. Thanks. I have a question on the database of fiber providers in that mapping, Tom, that you subscribe to. Does that give you then the name of the different providers? Or is it just
yes, it does. But it provides the names, but they do have to be subscribers to that system too. So sometimes we still have found there are others in the area, but it covers about 80% of the providers are maybe more in certain areas. But yeah, it does give you the provider. It shows you if it's Zayo or Arvig or Hiawatha Broadband or Verizon or whoever it is, and it actually tells you who they are.
Okay. Gene, you mentioned with Scott County and them using broadband as an incentive.
Yep.
Do you know if is broadband an available expenditure under TIF?
It is an available expenditure under TIF. In fact, when I was at DEED, we wrote that into the legislation.
Okay. Are there many examples of that being used? Do you know?
On a TIF basis, no, I do not. But what Scott County has chosen to do is they, again, look at that as an infrastructure piece, like a road, and so they're willing to make that investment as an incentive to grow their tax base.
Okay, very good. Good. We'd sure welcome any other questions in the chat box. Are there, you guys know of telecom providers that have prioritized this, that are working with Greater MSP or Great River in a partnership to try and do this kind of attraction?
From our standpoint, we work with CenturyLink. They are not only investors in Greater MSP, but we've created kind of a subcommittee of providers or organizations that are interested in data center development, and CenturyLink has been a player in that process with us.
Okay. Is that list of partners available that if people could see if their area providers are a part of that team?
It's kind of an ad hoc group, so it's a couple utilities, a couple engineering firms, construction companies, us, and CenturyLink.
Okay, okay, very good. Well, great. I don't see any other questions, and so I just want to thank Gene and Tom for this really excellent presentation. I think it is points to the need for communities to do their homework. I know that the Great River communities have done that, and that's a real positive thing to be ready to respond to businesses as they, whether manufacturers or data center, to be ready for those broadband questions. I know sometimes that's a challenge. Maybe we can get our provider friends to come on one of our webinars and they can tell us how to partner better with them. I see a number of community providers on the list though, so that's obviously they can start. Rod says Worthington has 7 providers. Can we possibly get a mega center in Worthington?
Well, yeah, it's possible. Part of actually, I'm going to be in Worthington tomorrow. We're co-op, Nobles County co-op down there. We've looked at a couple of sites. In our service territory, though, we don't have one identified that's really gone through the whole process. Now, we've looked out in the Brewster area because we know there's some solid infrastructure out there on power, but there's also some rail lines and things like that we need to avoid. So we've been working with Nobles Co-op to identify sites in their territory for sure.
Okay, good. You know, on the rail lines, it's so interesting because we have some big data centers by Elk River, and you know that's the main Burlington Northern line seems to drive right by those big new data centers. And just wondering how, if you guys have any reflections on that kind of contradiction.
Well, the specific rail is north of that Highway 10, so it is actually a little far away from the target areas that where those data centers are.
All right, so that's far enough.
I mean, it's probably a half mile away.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Good, good. Well, the slides will be available, And we'll post those in the blog, Blandin on Broadband blog, and people will be able to download those from that point. And once again, it's very interesting and very helpful to me to get a better appreciation. So now I'll turn it back to Mary.
Thanks, Bill. Thanks again to all of you, Bill, Tom, Jean, and all the participants for joining us on the webinar today. And I will send out an email once the blog post is up with the webinar recording and the slides. Gosh, where's my cursor? And our next webinar is scheduled for Thursday, March 10th, 2016, and the topic is spurring business use of broadband. Thanks everyone for attending today's webinar, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.